make sure we get our recording here, okay? Okay. All right, so it is 3:01. I am just going to get started. So welcome to our live Q&A session. For those of you that might be new or haven't joined before, we do either a live Q&A or an experiential workshop twice a month, usually on the first and third Thursday of the month. And so this week we're going to be answering some questions. Usually I'll address questions that were submitted in advance, but I will take moments of rest and pause to check in with our chat box and comment section so that I am answering questions as they pop up and as we go along. So please feel invited as I'm going through to type your thoughts and reflections in the chat, and I will make an effort to acknowledge and respond to them. So we did have a few questions to kind of kick us off this week. Am I anxious if I only ever felt real love with an avoidant partner? My fearful avoidant partner deepens the intimacy with me, but then they get angry with me for it. What's the deal there? How to interpret communication in relationships when cultural differences and attachment styles overlap? And how can I change my attraction patterns? So we're going to try to get to most of these today. And anything that we don't get to, we will have it at the top of the list the next time we meet. Also, if you're not aware, you can submit, any of my students can submit questions in advance through your student dashboard. It will be inside the live events replays module. You can access that through your mobile app or through the desktop when you log into your student dashboard. Okay, so let's tackle the first one. Am I anxious if I only felt real love with an avoidant partner? Am I doomed? So let's pull up my notes on this one. Okay, there was a little bit more of a description here. I don't know if I'm an anxious open heart now that I've listened to some of your videos. I've been married twice, but left both marriages after discovering unhealthy habits. Then I met someone in 2021 that I never expected to fall in love with. After 4 years, he broke up with me. I categorize him as emotionally unattached, and I feel heartbroken. Does that mean that I'm anxious attachment because I didn't feel this way in my previous marriages? Okay. So first, I just want to honor and acknowledge how tender this can be, because heartbreak has a way of inspiring us to kind of rewrite our entire identity, right? We start to look at the past through a certain colored lens. And sometimes it can make us ask questions like, was I naive? Was I anxious? Was I avoidant? What does this really say about me? And so when we look back and we realize that maybe the depth of emotion or emotional connection and attunement that you experienced in your marriages didn't reach this sort of activating level, it can stimulate kind of a disorienting question. So was that not even love? Did I only discover love now because of the intensity of this feeling? Or maybe was I living a half-life before? So if anybody watching this has ever loved someone who felt emotionally out of reach and then wondered if the intensity of that longing meant that something was either wrong with them or if it changed the meaning of your past relationships, let me know in the chat. I know this has definitely happened to me before. And so there are sort of 3 points that I want to offer around this. And it matters because it might help to kind of change the story you're telling yourself about this relationship. So the first thing I want to say is feeling more attached to someone emotionally unavailable does not automatically make you anxious. It can mean that the relationship stimulated an anxious response, right? I'm going to explain what I mean by that. Number 2, sometimes we choose safe partners. So maybe if you didn't feel the intensity with your marriage, your previous marriages, maybe they were safe partners and they were chosen for unconscious reasons. So maybe that looks like love on paper, but emotional distance in the body. I think I love them. I know I love them, but it's not landing in my body in the same way. That can sometimes be a form of avoidance, even if you are the people pleaser, even if you are the one who's giving a lot, even if you are the one over functioning in the relationship to make it work, to keep it together, to look past unhealthy habits that eventually became too much, right? So on the surface, we might say, oh yeah, maybe you were the overdoer in the relationship. But if you were withholding a certain degree of emotional connection, then even though you feel anxious now, you might have been carrying avoidant tendencies then, right? And anxiety and avoidance are really just two sides of the same coin. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The last thing I want to say about this is that maybe part of the growth challenge here is learning how to tell the difference between a love that can grow and evolve with you in a compatible way that incorporates both attraction and dimensions of compatibility, right? The values and priorities that you share. Being able to differentiate that from a degree of nervous system activation, right? And the intermittent reinforcement that we can sometimes receive when we are with someone that is emotionally unavailable, right? So that the intensity that you feel is placed in its proper context. So ideally, I want to be able to help you see where an attachment response really comes from, to give you an idea of what to focus on so you can be aware of what may be activated for you, what's available for you in this experience. And if you want a different experience moving forward, how you can kind of start to visualize that for yourself. Okay. So the first point, just to dig into these a little bit, looking at anxious attachment, let's say anxious impulses, as a form of nervous system activation. So a lot of people are not anxious in every relationship that they have. It could be that they become more anxiously attached because of what's going on in the relationship dynamic. So if you're with someone who is consistent, emotionally responsive, transparent, they do what they say and they say what they mean, right? Then that's a fertile ground to feel more secure and grounded in that relationship, right? But if you're with someone who's ambivalent, kind of confusing, hot and cold, hard to read, emotionally unavailable, or pulls back from discussions about vulnerability and emotions, now your nervous system is starting to feel uncertain. It may start to sense there's some degree of threat and instability here because something's being obscured, right? And maybe reassurances don't come as generously. And because the bond starts to feel uncertain, there is an increase of certain neurochemistry in your body. Okay. So our cortisol and our adrenaline starts to increase. And what happens is these are stress chemicals that create a sense of excitement and activation. And so when that happens, now we are experiencing a kind of high. And if your partner starts showing up intermittently, meaning on a sort of unpredictable and inconsistent schedule, with affection, with fun dates and activities, with attention and all the things that you really want, and then they withdraw those things or withhold those things inexplicably for an unpredictable amount of time, this creates an intermittent pattern of reinforcement in the brain. And that's going to stimulate the same parts of the brain that light up when we experience things like cocaine addiction or gambling addiction. Attachment actually lives in the same parts of the brain. So now we've got cortisol and adrenaline spiking because it's starting to perceive a threat. Then you've got dopamine coming in. Dopamine is released when you experience the pleasurable aspects, but it's also released at high levels of stress. Okay. Then when it's taken away, you might have your serotonin drop. And serotonin is when we have low serotonin, we have increased sexual interest, and increased obsessiveness. And people who have had a history of trauma or who have had some attachment wounds in their past tend to have a lower baseline of serotonin to begin with. So now let's say you have sex with this person. Now you've got oxytocin that is bonding you to them. And oxytocin is a chemical that they've done research studies on that show that when you have elevated levels of oxytocin in your body, you do not read negative feedback in the same way. So it's a chemical that kind of makes your brain foggy and forgets the negative outcome of things. And that prevents you from making decisions that might support your resiliency rather than falling for the same kind of thing over and over again. Right. So there's real neurochemical things going on inside the body when you're with someone that provides intermittent reinforcement that creates a kind of high. And if we've never experienced that kind of excitation before, we can think of it as love because there is a yearning. It feels almost like an addictive yearning. Not like it is an addictive yearning, but it's from the naturally occurring drugs in our body. And so the nervous system, when that person leaves now, it becomes inflamed looking for them because the mind and body thinks they are essential to your survival. And we have these neurochemicals convincing us of that on the physical level. So you might ask yourself, or we might have our inquirer ask themselves, in the 4-year relationship, did they consistently feel emotionally nourished, repeatedly chosen, prioritized, intimate? Or did they feel like they had to work for closeness and clarity? Sometimes. And sometimes it was those things. So usually when it's a weird mishmash of both is when we are the most activated and excited. Because when we feel that anxious yearning, we feel the anxious activation of the sympathetic nervous system. It's usually less about the presence of love and it's more about uncertainty. So the system says, if I can get just close enough to prove enough, understand enough, just to explain enough, be understood enough, then I can secure this connection and I will feel safe. And so we're kind of always like on the edge of it. And that's not the same thing as deep, profound love interwoven with compatibility, long-term compatibility. And so even a relatively secure person can become increasingly anxious when they are paired with someone who is emotionally detached, because a secure person can become insecure in the same way that children do when we grow up in insecure family dynamics, which means trying to understand how and why the other person is so insecure with us, right? Well, it must be something I'm doing. So we sort of naively try to fill in the gaps and to please them because we may not know why they're acting that way, and we make the best assumptions we can, right? It feels like a normal adaptation, but it's the nervous system trying to stabilize a bond that is ultimately unstable and unpredictable. And that kind of intermittent reinforcement throws your brain and body into, I mean, basically an addicted state. And it's going to, that activation, that excitement, that high is going to feel, it's going to stimulate that longing. And they're, oh, I need them. I want them. I feel so obsessive about them. I must be in love. This must be this elevated state of attraction. So now I want to talk about the second thing, which is that sometimes when we're with a partner that we don't feel that elevated state of anticipation or anxiety or wanting and longing, when we're with a safe partner, the other thing that can happen is we can stay hidden sometimes, right? So this person mentioned they didn't feel this excitation or attraction in their first 2 marriages. Now, I don't know much more than that. So on the one hand, it could be that they were stable relationships, but you mentioned that they ended because of unhealthy habits. I don't know more than that. So if you had two previous marriages and both of them wound up with unhealthy habits, and you didn't, in retrospect, you feel like you didn't really have that much attraction to them, but you were with them, even though there were these unhealthy habits, and you made a lifelong commitment twice, that tells me there's a pattern going on. And perhaps you weren't very conscious when you were in those relationships, meaning conscious of yourself, conscious of your feelings, conscious of your wants, your values and priorities, emotionally expressive, aware of what you were getting into and why. And I can say this because that definitely described me in my first marriage. It made sense. We got along. So the possibility is that maybe you were in those relationships because there was something about them that kind of allowed you to show up and manage them in a way that felt perhaps familiar, that felt perhaps not so activating, that maybe it just kind of made sense and you weren't all that connected to a deeper sense of emotional presence anyway. And if that's the case, then perhaps the anxiety you feel now is an indicator that sometimes we're avoidant until we meet someone who's more avoidant than us, right? And then their avoidance mirrors back to us our own avoidance, and we become anxious. When they hold that space, now the parts that we've been suppressing come up. And so maybe what you're realizing through the increased feelings of anxiety is the degree of avoidance that you've carried for so long. And it took someone more avoidant than you to call it up. And why and how does that happen? Well, because maybe in this relationship, the emotional risk feels higher. And maybe there's something in them that feels familiar in a way that is closer to your core. And because of that, now it has allowed these deeper anxious feelings to kind of shake loose. So this can kind of pan out in a couple ways. So first way is that, let's say in your past, right, the old relationships, the former marriages, maybe these partners had hidden unhealthy habits that revealed themselves later. And maybe that can point to a pattern early on where things looked fine on the surface, but underneath there was this sort of undercurrent of disconnection or emotional masking going on. And so if your early environment taught you that feelings were not discussed or issues were best left swept under the rug, then surface level stability can feel really familiar. It feels normal. It feels like, yeah, sure. Why wouldn't we commit to this? The second thing is that even if you were the one in those relationships holding it all together, over functioning, right, it can still be a form of hiding. So a lot of people think avoidance means coldness, disconnection, uninvolvement. But some avoidance looks like being the responsible one on paper, being the helper, being the stable one in a crisis, being the one that smooths everything over. And it can feel and look like devotion, but underneath there is a strategy in place to avoid being fully seen. All the things that you're doing are so helpful and responsible and wonderful for everybody else that nobody really looks that closely because they're too busy kind of feeding off of what you offer. So you might consider this in your marriages. Were you emotionally exposed, revealed, safe, or were you kind of managing it all? Right? Were you carrying emotional labor in some way? Because sometimes it's not that love was absent per se. Maybe there was love there. I'm sure there was. But the vulnerability wasn't there. And to my mind, it makes sense that you'd be asking this question now, or that you might call in a relationship that just catalyzes you into this new level of activation, because after 2 marriages and 2 sort of incremental awakenings, let's call it, meaning you chose for yourself twice not to keep putting up with that, it means that you're probably ready for something deeper. Like your soul was calling for something that made you feel more alive. So your soul calls in someone that maybe mirrors back to you all the ways in which you are maybe pinching yourself off from that. So that's kind of like my third point. We're talking about polarization, that that sometimes when we meet someone who is, maybe we have avoidant tendencies, and meet someone who's more avoidant than us, now we're anxious, right? I have a siren going on outside. I don't know if you can hear it. It's very noisy in this block. It's very New York. If Zoom should block it out, but I apologize if you can hear it. And I live in Manhattan, and I'm on a corner, a relatively popular corner. Sometimes there's a lot of noise going on. Okay, so polarization. How can the avoidance in them pull out the anxiety in us? So when we've carried our own form of avoidance for self-protection, and then we meet someone who is even more unavailable than we are, a polarization can happen in the relationship. So at first, it can feel really calming. It can feel really safe, right? Maybe it feels like they're really steady and sure. Maybe there's a little bit of mystery involved, which kind of sparks some intrigue. They seem really cool and kind of grounded. And these are some wonderful traits that our avoidant Rolling Stones can have. This is particularly enticing if we have lived through a period or a childhood where there was lots of mixed signals. Things were unstable, chaotic. And so when we encounter this quiet, calm kind of strength, it feels very containing. But sometimes we mistake that calm, quiet strength for presence, when at the core of it, it's a form of detachment. And if that's the case, if you come to learn this, if that's the case, then over time, the appreciation for the cool, calm groundedness is going to evolve into a feeling of longing, a feeling of being starved for that kind of emotional presence. And then it creates anxiety within us. And we start searching for it. I know it's there. I know it's there. And we're leaning in and we're reaching in and we're over explaining and we're hoping and we're waiting and we're writing long messages, hoping that these words will string together some kind of bridge that will stitch us back together, close the gap between us. And all of a sudden, you become the emotional one. Not because you were ever inherently anxious or hysterical or emotional, but because the relationship requires one person to carry the emotional labor because the other person refuses to do it. And this is communicated in any number of verbal and nonverbal ways, right? Energetically. So you might ask yourself now about this most recent relationship. Did the love grow in the spaces where you felt met? Meaning the love for them, did it grow from mutual interests, shared values, places where you connected? Or was it growing from moments of relief where you came back together and that felt like relief? Or growing from a sense of excitation, right? That actually stems from maybe some fantasizing going on or trying to fill the gap in some way. Or, and these would be the spaces where there's the risk of losing them. We might say, well, the risk of losing them made me appreciate them all the more. Did it? Or did it just feel like relief when they finally showed up or called you back? Because if the bond is intensified through uncertainty, then it's likely the part of what you are grieving in the wake of that heartbreak is not just the person, but it's a version of you that came online, right? So again, back in the beginning, when their cool, calm, groundedness felt really great, all of a sudden there were these other parts that could come up because they got to be the cool, calm, grounded one, which means you got to be a little bit of something else, which means some of your vulnerability got to come up, which means a part of you felt safe enough to come online, right? To come alive. And that aliveness is real. It's absolutely real. That aliveness is absolutely real, even mixed among all the neurochemicals that keep us in a state of longing and anxiety. But it doesn't always wind up being tied to emotional availability. So you got an opportunity to expand your capacity, right? Now it's about holding that capacity with consistency. And it sounds like this partner wasn't able to do that with you. So does that make you an anxious open heart? I think it means that your heart is capable of deep love. I think it means that your nervous system is learning how to bond powerfully. And it means that the relationship opened up something now that is probably important for you to heal and to reclaim for yourself. Now, I'm not going to read meaning into it because that's your job. But there's probably meaning there for you. There's probably a soul lesson there for you, looking at not only what does this mean in terms of my attachment style, but what does this mean now in the greater context of my life? What's available for me here in the learning? So we might start by labeling things because that helps us make sense of them. But the label is just to help you understand a pattern so that you can start to love without losing yourself. So you can take command of that pattern and evolve it if you want to. So heartbreak can be a doorway into secure love. Absolutely. Heartbreak can be an opportunity to sweep out the dusty corners where we might be pinching ourselves off from the kind of love that we want. We can use it to build self-trust instead of self-blame. We can learn to choose partners that are emotionally available the next time. We can learn to sift and sort through, is this anxious chemistry or is this my intuitive wisdom? Right? So some reflection questions could be, when I felt the most in love, was I feeling deeply met or was I feeling deeply uncertain? In my past relationships, was I avoiding intimacy and making it work by overfunctioning, fixing, keeping things fine, people pleasing on the surface, when inside I actually felt like it was sort of a house of cards? So these are some questions to kind of sit with. And these are the kind of questions that we really dig into in our membership program, the Secure Spark Studio. So we meet on a weekly basis for live group coaching, guided practices, art therapy techniques, and EFT tapping practices to walk through questions like this together. If you want to learn more about that, I will share a link with the replay when I send that out. We have some feedback in our chat here. Intense energy between the two is always toxic. Could it be strong intensity, the call for a more profound relationship after two failures? And this one opens more wounds that we're not aware of, but also opens consciousness. Still, the both are not evolving at the same pace, and communication brings misunderstanding. How to know if it's toxic or not. So maybe we'll talk about this in our next, maybe we'll do a workshop on this. So intense energy, right? Energy is mechanical. So when I look at, I like to look at human design to talk about energy and attraction, because I think human design really just defines attraction so well without stigmatizing anything, that it's just mechanical. But your machinery is going to feel more attracted to a certain type of someone else's machinery because you happen to have better matched nuts and bolts, right? So attraction and chemistry can be a wonderful thing, it's one element. The other element is looking at compatibility and your values and priorities. So it's lovely when chemistry is present. Where we get a little bit tricky is when we start assigning a whole lot of meaning to it, right? The meaning is what we make of it. So chemistry is just what happens when you add, sulfur to fire. What happens when you pour gasoline on a fire? It gets bigger. What happens when you put two people who have the same wounding at their core together? They feel chemistry and they push-pull each other. So that's predictable. If it's predictable, does that mean it's meaningless? That's up to you to decide what the meaning is. What does this mean in the context of my life? That's a soul question. That's a spiritual question, right? Maybe that's the way the laws of attachment work, because somewhere along the line, you had a soul contract or curriculum that said, in this lifetime, you are going to confront issues of worthiness and a need to claim yourself in a more profound and deeply spiritual way. So how do I write a curriculum for myself that would stimulate that kind of lesson learning? I know, pour gas on a fire. So that means I need a little bit of this and I need a little bit of that. So that means in my midlife, I will have 2 failed marriages. And then right when I am feeling frustrated and I am maybe at a point where I am so wounded that I can surrender aspects of my ego, meaning the parts of me that kept trying to fix and make it work, finally give up. I am willing, soft enough, wanting enough for someone to come in and just strip me bare of every other defense I'm carrying. And even though I don't want to feel it, become the anxious, burdensome, nervous person that I've always tried to avoid becoming. And there I am in my fullness. And it feels weird and it feels awful because I've got all these stories about how I'm not supposed to be like this. And yet there you are in your fullness. And there's an opportunity for wholeness in this experience. If I can write it out, if I can listen to the voices that are coming up, and I can talk with them, and I can evolve them, and I can be compassionate towards them. And then maybe they'll stop punishing me, these voices that I carry, right? So attraction to me is machinery, right? It's predictable sometimes, and it can be delicious. It's information. Okay, so now I know that piece works. What about these other pieces? But if we haven't felt bonded in the past, if we have these wounds, from our history, then that connection feels so satisfying because we haven't developed enough of a variety of experience with attraction in healthy ways to know when it's just attraction and all this other stuff is equally important. And so if we have an empty bucket and that attraction fills up enough of it, we're going to assign a lot of meaning to it because the rest of this feels less important now. So that's really some of the lesson learning that comes in, is that, oh, no. All of this is equally as important. And so now we learn how to be present with what needs to be filled up. And we become increasingly aware of, oh, someone can help me with this up to 50%. I got to help myself with this the rest of the way. And usually that's a big lesson that comes up because it becomes mirrored in every other discussion you have: boundaries, compatibility, What do we want in life? How do we interact with each other? How do we converse with each other? Here's what's mine. Here's what's yours. This is what I'm responsible for. This is as much as you can help me with it. I mean, that's really just that just defines all relationships ever, right? And we're always trying to figure it out. Yeah. Good question. Okay, my fearful avoidant partner keeps trying to deepen things with me, but then expresses anger with me like I made them do it. What's the deal? Okay. So I'll start by saying mine was a habit of fearful avoidance when I was getting in my early life, and then transitioning from being more fearful avoidant to being more insecure. And what you're describing here is very characteristic of fearful avoidance. So this attachment style forms when the same attachment figure was both a source of love and a source of threat. And so as a result, we have different parts of our psyche that become kind of, I want to use the word codified, but what I mean by that is they become sort of like these little subpersonalities. We call them parts, right? So different parts of us start to carry their own sort of energy and consciousness. And these different parts of us disagree with each other about closeness. So one part is going to long for connection and invite intimacy and deepen that intimacy. And then another part, often what we might call a protective part or a managing part, starts to panic when that closeness arrives. And it reacts with, could be anger, could be blame, to try to push it away, right? And those are feelings that typically mask more painful, vulnerable feelings like helplessness or exposure, right? And so when you have a fearful avoidant partner or spice of lifer that is deepening the relationship and then seems to get mad at you for being so close to them, it's that inner conflict now being projected onto you. So and that's because they struggle with boundaries. So they're very unsure about who am I, who are you, where do I begin, where do you end? They absorb a lot from others. And so they struggle to know, where do I begin and end in relationships? And so inevitably now the inner monologue sort of spills out into the shared space. You get absorbed into it almost as if by osmosis, and you've become part of the projection. So they kind of, I don't want to say bully because it's not intentional, but usually it's not intentional, but they kind of start seeing you in the role that they've assigned to you from a past blueprint, a former screenplay, let's say. You've been hired to be an actor in an old screenplay. And so when that happens, as much as we might understand and have compassion for that, we have to separate compassion from responsibility and accountability. So we can understand what their fears might be, but it's not our job to take it on. We can help them with it, but it's not our job to absorb it, to heal it for them, even though they might want to give you that job and then resent you for it. Because even though part of them wants to give you that job, to heal it, to fix it for them, to be everything that they never had for them, there will be another part that will hate you for that, because on some level, it takes away their agency. It robs them of the ability to earn that for themselves, to do it for themselves. And that's what they ultimately need to learn how to do. So what is within your control is to show up with steadiness, name the impact of their behavior, and then establish clear boundaries that protect your well-being, both of your well-being. If you're protecting your well-being, you're protecting their well-being. Absolutely. But what's not within your control is resolving that inner conflict for them. because you're their partner. You're not their therapist. And even a therapist isn't going to resolve the inner conflict for them. But the therapist just has more tools, and it's just a more appropriate space in which they can get in there and try to help them develop the inner scaffolding that maybe they don't quite have fully developed just yet. Because the stakes in a therapeutic relationship are very different than the stakes that are available in a love relationship. So for that pattern to truly shift, particularly with fearful avoidance, and I know because I was a spice of life for a very long time, your partner has to be willing to do their own inner work. Because I would say avoidant partners, yes, but fearful avoidant partners more than anybody. It's inside them. The walls, the blocks, the walls are internalized. So more often than not, what's preventing the relationship from truly evolving exists inside them. And even if they were in the safest relationship under the sun, the safety could trigger them. Right? So your partner has to be willing to do their own inner work, ideally in therapy, so they can learn how to tolerate safety. And more than tolerate it, learn how to enjoy it and let love in. Right? So again, this is the work we do in the Secure Spark Studio. If you're interested in learning more, I'll include a link with the replay. Learning to finally love myself through strong mirroring, being reasonable for myself and not him. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Okie dokie. We had another question here. So another question was, how to interpret communication in relationships when cultural differences and attachment styles overlap. Okay, so there's a little more detail. I recently learned that British English can be emotionally understated, indirect, and polite in ways that can hide your true feelings. But avoidantly attached people can also speak in vague or minimized ways. So how do I know if someone is showing an interest, being polite, or acting from avoidant patterns if they are British? For context, I'm very direct and expressive. I say what I feel, I share openly, and I don't hide my emotions. This attracted someone who was avoidant and a British English teacher. Okay. He later told me he needed to dose my energy and decide when to turn the connection up or down. He was calm, shy, and even nervous around me. One example, I once told him about donkeys I would visit during a storm who followed me and cried out when I left. He said the donkeys were a bit like him. I still don't know if he meant he feels lonely or if he was just joking or if he was hinting at something deeper. So my question is, how can I understand this understatement, what it means, as opposed to what avoidant language might look like? And how do I tell the difference between politeness, genuine emotion, and avoidance? Okay, there's a lot of layers here. I think you've got some really juicy information here when he talks about you offering this visual of some lost donkeys that follow you home and then cry out when you leave, and him saying it's a bit like him. I think he's sharing something there in a joking way, but I think it is hinting at something deeper about how he perceives himself and how much he has affection for you, right? I'm a lovesick donkey, and all that that might imply. I'm a lovesick lost donkey. So it's really an insightful question because cultural communication and attachment communication can look similar, but it can come from different places, emotionally and energetically speaking, right? So a simple guideline might be that culture tends to shape the style, but attachment will shape the function. So for instance, let's say British communication is emotionally modest, indirect, or somewhat softened, right? Indirect. And maybe people minimize emotions or make subtle jokes, dry humor. Maybe they avoid strong statements because that's more polite and comfortable, culturally speaking. That doesn't automatically mean that they're avoidant. So avoidant attachment, it's going to show up in more than words. It's going to be patterns that protect the person from feeling too vulnerable. So things like restricting the amount of closeness that you experience, or expressing emotions indirectly because the directness feels risky. And so if you ask for directness, it's beyond cultural, sensitivity. It's more that they can't do it, right? Becoming visibly nervous, closing up physically when someone is increasingly open, taking time and space away to recharge because they feel emotionally overwhelmed, not fully engaging with the emotions that they might be hinting at. So for instance, wow, that you tell him the story about the donkeys and he says, "Oh, that's me. I'm a lost donkey that's head over heels for you." And maybe he says it in a charming kind of witty way, but instead of smiling shy, looking down, putting his hands in his pockets, shrugging his shoulders and kind of walking next to you, but kind of also like closing up after kind of revealing this thing. He says, "Oh, I'm a lonely donkey for you." He grabs you, pulls you closer, and gives you a kiss. So this one is probably more avoidant, and the reaching out after this confession and show of affection is probably less avoidant, more open and secure, right? So they hint and then they demonstrate. That's more secure. If they hint and then they pull away and avoid full engagement, that's more avoidant. So to me, it does sound like it's a metaphor for him, the way he reflected on your story. And it's kind of a sideways emotional disclosure. And it sounds like he didn't follow it up with direct vulnerability, whether nonverbal or in physical or otherwise. So in essence, the meaning becomes clearer when you look at a pattern over time, not just a few phrases here and there. I suspect you wouldn't even be asking this question, even if he does speak in British English and is, minimizes things and whatnot, because even with that language, the nuances of language, there would be all the other ways in which he'd interact with you, which would make you feel secure and comfortable in knowing that his affection is true for you. Right. So when you open up emotionally, does he move closer to you or does he pull back? Have any of the indirect comments ever led to a more open conversation, or do they always stay vague and indirect? Is he always showing up as kind of shy and nervous, even as the relationship deepens and trust continues to grow between you? Does he seem overwhelmed by your expressiveness, or has he learned to engage with it the more he gets to know you? Does he initiate connection at least 50% of the time, or are you always the one who has to initiate things and he just responds to you? So patterns like this, factoring in the nuances of language and culture, can help you kind of lean into, is this politeness, cultural communication, or is it that layered on top of an avoidant attachment strategy? And of course, it's important to honor your experience too, because maybe you have more directness, you have more emotional clarity and expressiveness. And that can feel refreshing to someone who struggles with it. But it can also activate that instinct to create distance, because as much as they're attracted to it, they're also overwhelmed by it. So I think that your curiosity here is really strength, and it shows that you're trying to understand your interactions without losing your own clarity. And you're also being very generous in the relationship and trying to see and understand things from his perspective and understand the threads of cultural influence and so on. And so this is, I think that you are showing up with a beautiful intention and awareness. Just be mindful that your level of understanding and your intellectual curiosity doesn't get in the way of explaining away something that could otherwise be a hint as to what's really here for you, meaning explaining away the impact. So for instance, if you are looking for someone who can meet you on the level of more direct communication and emotional expressiveness, it's okay that maybe his style, culturally speaking, is more minimizing or indirect, as long as he can show up for you with that directness and expressiveness somewhere along the way, and certainly as the relationship grows, right? So I hope that helps. Where are we at? We're at 3:52. I'm going to take a pause. And I just want to acknowledge those of you that are here in the room with me. Any reflections, questions, or thoughts popping up? I'd like to just maybe on. Oh, Deborah, I think I see you there.
Hi. Thank you so much. I'm still not sure what my attachment style is. Is there a simple test, or I joined you a while ago and then I kind of lost touch. So I'm hoping I can get reignited with this.
What may I ask creates the confusion? So for instance, when you hear certain descriptions and you say, yes, that's me, no, that's not me, what feels like yes, what feels like no?
I don't have them all in front of me, but probably so it's just it's a self-evaluation. That's how you figure out your style. It's not like a test, a complicated test you have to take, some big mystery.
Most attachment style assessments, they are self-evaluating, but when you do tests like that, it can be helpful to have someone who's close to you, a relatively objective person who's close to you, also answer the questions for you. Because sometimes it's hard for us to see into our blind spots, right?
Okay.
So there is a more detailed test. Let me see if I can find the link to that. I'll send it out with the replay. There's a more detailed evaluation you can take. It's an outside research institution where it'll evaluate you on different dimensions of experience. So not just romantic relationships, but also to your parents, to your work relationships and friends. And so sometimes what happens is we also have the ability to compartmentalize. So we can be mostly, for instance, we can also be secure in most facets of our lives. But when it comes to this one area, for some reason, I feel anxious, right? But I don't meet the full criteria. So for instance, there's also anxious preoccupied and anxious ambivalent. So anxious preoccupied there's less consciousness around it. It's more like, I want it, I need it, and I'm going to do what it takes to get it. I don't care how needy I look. I don't care if anyone thinks that I'm pushy. This is how it's going to go. And because I need it, I'm going to do what it takes to get it. So this is a more preoccupied anxiety. It's demanding. It's very fully present. When we have anxious ambivalent, there's usually a little more awareness and therefore a more of an internal kind of monologue going on, where it's sort of like, I feel that impulse, but if I express it, I'm going to look needy and burdensome. And I don't want to look needy and burdensome, so I'm just going to clamp it down. And then I'm going to hold back a little bit. And I'm just going to kind of make it work, because as much as I don't really like that thing, I don't think I can leave this situation. I do feel attached to it, but I can't express this because I'll look weird or something like that. So this is more like anxious ambivalent. When we have dismissive avoidance, This is when we have someone who is disconnect from the feeling altogether. So they're not aware that they have feelings. They might absorb the feelings of others. So for instance, if they have a very effusive partner who walks in and gets angry, now they're angry, and then they get overwhelmed and then they shut it off and then they go somewhere else. And those weren't my feelings, that was their feelings. Or they have no connection. They think I must have feelings because I'm doing these things, but I'm not connected to it at all. I don't know why I'm doing these things. Or they have ailments, migraines, stomach pain, lower back pain, joint pain, inexplicable immune deficiencies. It becomes deeply embodied. And they're very disconnected from it on a conscious level. Fearful avoidance is basically anxious ambivalent on steroids, where it's kind of like they have a wide range of emotional access, and they're hyper aware of other people's emotions, and they can read other people's emotions accurately. But the way it's sifted and sorted and organized inside feels chaotic. It's like they have an avoidant and an anxious person living inside of them that are constantly at war with each other. And for me, what really qualifies disorganized or fearful avoidant attachment is the presence of dissociation. It becomes so intense that the body numbs out, shuts down, becomes dissociated, can't recall a chronological story. If you were to ask them to give them a timeline of your life and story, you'd forget. You wouldn't be able to recall important events. You wouldn't be able to recall important details. Dates and times would get mixed up. You'd leave out important things. Family members would say, well, what about that time you said this, that, and the other thing? And you'd be shocked. I would never say and do such a thing. Meanwhile,
That so sounds like me. Oh my God. That seems like the most messed up one. Are you pretty quick at figuring out other people's styles, would you say?
Well, of course, it depends on what they're willing to share with me. So,
and is it possible to, is this something that I'm always going to kind of have to wrestle with, or is it possible to become so aware that I can overcome it, that I can
sure. Well, as I said, I describe it this way because that was my experience personally. And I think for me, it was really adopting a more spiritual approach to the way I move through life and connecting to something larger than myself, larger than relationships, larger than other people, that allowed me to find a place of self and center. Because for me, there was at the basis of it, I didn't really believe I had a right to exist, let alone have my feelings, let alone a right to want anything. So,
and this all happens in childhood. These ideas are from what
someone who has disorganized attachment it's more likely to have been a result of childhood stuff, but it can happen the older you get, depending on the severity of the trauma you experience. I mean, the other thing is that if we get mixed signals, mixed messages, this can install that as well. Particularly if we had maybe it wasn't severe abuse, neglect, addiction issues, war, trauma, whatever, but it could have been that we had a more narcissistic leaning parent who was very charismatic and the community loves them and most things seem to work out for them, but there's these mixed signals that we get that make us highly conflicted because there's no way through it. So for instance, I'm sorry I'm late to your important thing, but what about my struggle in getting here? The whole world doesn't revolve around you. Or no, I would never say that you're a burden. I don't know how I'm going to manage to feed all these ungrateful mouths. Or yeah, I mean, I'd love it if somebody could help me, but you can't do it because if you did, you'd just mess it up and I'd have to redo it anyway. Or there's no right way through it. And so on the one hand, you can't do anything right, but don't leave me or because I'll fall to pieces, right? It's just, there's no clear way through it. And so years and years and years of messages like that can also create a disorganized sort of orientation because there's no acknowledgement of, you as an autonomous being in that scenario, and there's nothing you can do to garner the approval. It's that sort of like that expression, like no good deed goes unpunished, right? That's kind of the experience you have. And so it becomes a kind of emotional, it's an emotional pattern that gets installed. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the result of severe abuse. It can just be years of a kind of emotional dismissals.
Thank you. Yeah, my mom was that way. She was narcissistic for sure.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I hope that was helpful.
Yes, it was. Thank you.
Good. Great questions. Extreme episode of dissociation now. Yeah. So we'll wrap this up. Thank you all for joining me here in the space and for asking such great questions. I'm going to send out the link to the replay, and we'll include, if you're interested in learning more about the Secure Spark Studio, we have a free introductory training. You can check it out. There'll be a little demo of how we work with these things in the studio. And I'll also send a link to that more detailed attachment assessment that I mentioned. It's not my assessment. It's an assessment with an outside research institute and facility. You can take the whole assessment and it will give you results at the end. You do not have to enter in your email or your personal information. But if you do, they will keep it for you and then send it to you. And you can go back after time and continue taking it, and it will show you your progress over time. So for instance, I took this thing 8 years ago, and every year I go and I take it again, and it just shows me how my attachment leanings have changed over time. So and also it contributes to a body of research on the topic. So I'll send that out. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. So I'll send that out. And if any questions or other thoughts come up, please feel invited to share inside of our student group. And we will meet again in 2 weeks. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your week and your day.
Thank you.
Bye.